I wanted to come to a place that I admire, Bloomberg in New York, of course, to talk about information and how information is changing our world. What's interesting to me is how serious the situation we have globally now is, the set of challenges that we face ahead of us. The economic crisis, which everybody here is very, very familiar with. 1/6 of US homes are underwater, right? Not literally, but they maybe will be with climate change, you never know. Unemployment on the rise, and so forth and so on. The likelihood of a reasonably protracted recession, we'll see what actually happens. Now we see at Google, we see search queries as a leading indicator. So in our case, for example, people are interested in purchasing safe investments. The most interesting query that rose up was home safes. So what does that tell you about, they're not buying beds to put their money in, they're putting money in their home safe. So that's pretty interesting. And if you take a look at that and the dependence on oil and the issues of debt and credit and the size of the deficit, these will be tremendous challenges, perhaps the greatest in a generation for our next president, whoever he is. And to me, this unique time in history with respect to the internet is equally challenging and interesting. We have the most powerful information system that we've ever created by any means, and I am optimistic. And I'm optimistic fundamentally because I believe information is power and information is becoming much and more ubiquitous. In Google's case, we're going to respond to this crisis by focusing on what we do best. Sergey has a quote that I particularly like. He says that scarcity builds clarity. And when the company was very small, for example, we didn't do any advertising at all. We sort of did our thing, got the products out, solved various end user problems. So the point is that you can build great businesses even in the most difficult times as you go ahead. So let me offer some hypotheses. I think a first hypothesis is that within our lifetimes, virtually all of the world's information will be, all the world's population will be able to access almost all the world's information. Now that is in and of itself an incredible achievement. Let us review the history of monks. Monks were chosen right around the time the printing press was invented because of their ability to write tiny because paper was so scarce. That was the primary criteria. It wasn't education or what have you or political affiliation. It was literally penmanship. If you think about the internet now, look at its scale in terms of growth rates. 1.4 billion internet users, 200 million new users a year. People accessing the internet on mobile phones. The number is more than 3 billion mobile phones. The next 3 years, we're going to add another billion people to the connected world. I mean, think about it. That's a billion people who literally have no communication with us now. We don't know what they think. We don't know what their life experiences are. And by the way, they're probably pretty miserable, right? So we're going to find out. And we're going to find out about their creativity and their hopes and whether they like Britney Spears or not. You get the idea. So, and these trends are pretty profound. If you look at China, China has more than 200 million internet users, more than 400 million mobile phone users. The growth rate is phenomenal, very, very quickly as we see that the changes are occurring. And everybody has a thirst for information. If you put a broadband connection right in the middle of a village, guess what? Everybody gets on it and goes, oh wow, look at that, isn't that neat, and so forth and so on. And then after the novelty wears down, everybody uses it for news and information. Big surprise. No different from us, no matter what their race, what their religion, what their cultural values are. So to me, and we've been doing this a lot, to me, the most interesting point is that this will occur now, right in front of us. A second hypothesis is that the power of creativity and expression will be in everyone's hands, and people have a lot to say. Now, one of the most alarming statistics that I came up with in getting ready for this was that there were 120 million blogs created every day. Is that right? Yes, 20,000, excuse me. 50% of them are created by people under the age of 19. 13 hours of video are uploaded every minute into YouTube, and 4,800 pictures are uploaded every minute into our Picasa web service, which is a web service for photos. So not only do people have a lot to say, but they're photographing it, and they're recording it, and so forth. So all of a sudden, this is all really, really happening. And of course, the web is social. 1 out of every 6 minutes spent online is now spent on a social network. Judging from this audience, some of you do this, and most of you do not. No surprise there. But the fact of the matter is this is defining for a new generation of internet users. And the growth rates are astounding, 20%, 30%, 40%, 45% a year in each of these categories. So in a world where people can access anything and anyone can publish anything, all bets are off. Third hypothesis is that the internet will bring economic, educational, and political opportunity to billions of people. Right? You get them all connected, you get them all, and this amazing thing that's going on, and all of a sudden, an amazing thing can now occur. Everyone can begin conversations with facts. Right? So here's the new modality. Somebody says something to you and you go, nah, right? Now, educated people, or people who at least are paying attention, will now learn to check. So for example, you know how there are all these urban myths, and did you know that, this presidential candidate did this, and this happened, and this evil person did this, and so forth? Check it, okay? A good example of a place where you can check it is called Snopes, where a lot of these urban legends, and people get themselves into frauds over things which are just false. So the point is that not only can somebody say something to you, but you can check it, and then you can decide whether you want to correct it or not. That's enough. Thank you. And that's enough pictures. Thank you. I think you've taken enough pictures to upload to Picasa for a while. Sorry, just kidding. So in a situation where everybody can start conversation with facts, you may not be less political, but the politics will be different. Then people will start using facts and then sort of constructing arguments at least from a fact basis, and then we can at least argue over our facts. Another hypothesis is that we're in a massive shift in how we're doing computing. And you take it for granted now, but it's called computing in the cloud. In our case, we're moving to what is called a cloud computing model. Instead of having computers and so forth which are sitting in your desk, they're sitting in a server somewhere. Literally in the cloud is the way we describe it. And this has a lot of implications for small businesses. Most of you, if you were to leave your firm and go to a small business, you'd have to hire an IT department who would then charge you lots and lots of money to set up a server that they would then leave, that then would break the moment they left. Right? This is sort of how IT works. Is we built a huge profession doing it this way. In this new model, it's all outsourced. You sign up, you fill out the forms, which may or may not be easy, but in most cases it's a lot easier, and the thing just stays up. You have the adults, if you will, running the data centers and providing that service. This is possible now because of the redundancy of the internet. It was not possible 5 or 10 years ago, although many people tried. And so, for example, 3,000 Google applications, 3,000, businesses sign up for Google Apps every day. Now, these are small businesses. A smaller number of large businesses, obviously. But when they sign up, they say, well, why should I have all this IT stuff? So all of a sudden, this is very interesting. And of course, as computing power gets stronger, the rest of this happens. Another example of here is what you can do with universal translation. Since everything's on the web, everything can be translated automatically. And if you can today, Google can translate into 23 different language pairs. And we have customers that now use automatic translation to talk to their employees. So they'll type something, press a button, and it'll be automatically translated in real time to that. Eventually, it'll be possible on a phone to speak into it and have it do automatic translation. Today, you can do it with text. You sit there and you go, the number of books in the Library of Alexandria is 1 million books. 500,000 of them are in Arabic that have never been translated, have never been seen. So there's a large corpus of Islamic text and understanding that nobody really understands. So now we can automatically scan it and translate it and so forth. And of course, as part of that, there are new ways of search coming along. Image search, text search, so forth and so on. And we have various interesting products that we do that. So then to put that together, these changes are happening faster than ever before. The statistics are quite interesting. It took 50 million users in North America. It took 37 years for radio, 15 years for television, 6 years for cable, and 3 years for the internet. Okay? So by the way, what's the next one that will take half of 3 years? I don't know if I knew, I'd invest in that business. But clearly time is compressing. And this is not a new fact. If you look back 300 years or 400 years, time compression has been a characteristic of globalization for many, many, many generations before us. And the underlying technology base case is that Moore's law, which everybody's familiar with here, processing power doubles every 18 months, 10 times every 5 years, pretty interesting, 100 times every 10. So what's different now between what I'm saying now versus what I said in 1998? a factor of 100 in performance, broadband, networking, and so forth. The arguments weren't wrong then, the technology had not quite caught up. Now it's possible. So you imagine 10 years from now what it's going to be like. There's another law called Kreider's law, which is basically that memory, in particular disk memory, doubles every year. So it's growing even faster. By the way, that's 1,000 times in 10 years. So you wonder what we're going to do with all those disk drives? We're going to fill them with even more stuff. Pictures, movies, recordings of everything. And then we're happy to do that because we're Google, we're busy, happy letting you search it. So in that model, computing resources become much more like electricity. It shifts from an asset to a utility. And while it's not going to be so cheap you can't meter it, the fact of the matter is that declining cost industries like computing are such that we take them for granted now. And in fact, the marginal cost is zero. I still remember when my mobile phone, all of a sudden, there was no difference between local calls and long-distance calls. That was a really big deal for me. So what's the point when internet access and access to the kinds I'm talking about are so literally cheap that there's no difference, that they're ubiquitous, you can get them everywhere, you fundamentally never have to pay for them, you pay for them in other ways. And this, in my view, represents an opportunity for innovation for our industries as a whole. If you think that the interesting story that the electric dynamo was 1832, which is the thing that you use to generate power, it took 50 years for it to get into a proper plant. So the point is, in technology, these things have historically taken a long time. The HTML, which is the way the web was built, was published in roughly 1993. So that's something which has gotten to the stage in 15 years. What's the next one? Well, the one that I like to think about is an iPod, hugely successful device. But if you compound these laws and you say, what can I do with an iPod in 2019, you could store 85 years of video on this device, which means that you'll never be able to watch it. It's the most frustrating device you'll ever have. You're carrying around more video than you can consume. I mean, I'm assuming you're not going to sleep for 85 years, which is probably a bad strategy. But it gives you a sense of the scale. And I think one of the things that we forget here in technology, here at Bloomberg, here in New York, we forget the scale of these things and how quickly they're coming. And by the way, they're not slowing down because of the global recession, et cetera. All of these technology things are playing. So this has a lot of implications. It means, for example, that there's this rise of this new generation, which all of us are now conscious of. It's called, many people call them digital natives. People spend more time on social networks than on email. If you talk to college students today, many of them will say email is too slow. I asked one of them, why do you not watch the news on television? And she said, it's too slow, right? Everything is so immediate. So one of the lessons to be learned about this space is everything is quick. And by quick, I mean very, very responsive. So when you go to the web and you see one of these websites, there's one of these beautiful, expensive, and you know that they spent $100,000 to these beautiful web designers for this nice flash thing, and you click, and it wait and wait and wait. So you realize that they wasted all of their money. That the web is about speed and access and very, 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 very quick manipulation. And I think that's going to be true for many, many years. And what's interesting, by the way, is that as a generational shift, this is really, really frightening. You've got teens putting information out in public that it's obvious when they grow up they're going to regret. My current proposal there is that we change the law that at the age of 21 you can just change your name. Say, that was not me. Right, I didn't, kind of looks like me, makes sense. It becomes socially acceptable to say, hey, that was just an earlier instance of me. It was my sister or my brother or what have you. And when you grow up with the assumption that you'll always be able to publish whatever you want to say to whoever you want to say it, it changes the way people interact. We have a Google executive who has decided she has 2 small children, and she's documented every single event of their lives on a public blog from their birth. So what are they going to say to their mother at 13 or 14, aside from, I hate you, right? I mean, just think about it psychologically. And then I thought, well, but maybe if all of their friends have the same experience, they'll say, oh yeah, these are just old people. They're just, whatever. In other words, the social norm may change, and there are plenty of examples of social norms that change. If you think about it as a model, if the phone allows you to be a paparazzi and the bloggers allows you to become a reporter, and YouTube allows you to become a filmmaker, then what's happened to privacy? Put another way, and there are many, many examples of this. I often think about there's a future president of the United States alive today who is a teenager, who his or her name we don't know, who is currently generating a record of something that will be a big problem 30 years from now, right? I mean, Bill Clinton said, I didn't inhale. Well, what if we had a picture, right? Obama in his book talks about how he experimented with things. What if we had a picture? On the other hand, 30 years from now, maybe everyone will have pictures, in which case it doesn't really matter. So society does change with respect to these issues. Now the technologies have limitations. Technologies are not the only solution to everything. If you look, culture does hold things back. An interesting example has to do with samurai. And Japan, when the sort of non-Japanese invaded Japan and said, welcome to the full world here, and imported guns, the Japanese culture sort of rejected them because it thought that the sword and so forth was much more elegant and much more properly positioned. It took a very long time for that to change, probably good. If you think about it, culturally, the issues around loan incentives and subprime mortgages, all the things that we've just been through, those are largely cultural, not technical. We could have solved it in a different way. But my point is that cultural norms can change. And it's important for us as a group to talk about what those might be and how they might change. And I don't think technology trumps people. I think people are in charge of technology. It's important to remind ourselves who is in charge. Ultimately, problems are solved by people. And usually as a technologist, my assumption is if there's a technology problem, there's also a technology solution. And so let's really talk about that. And I think what happens often is you get so wedded to your computer, your Bloomberg terminal, your web service, what have you, that there can be alienation. In fact, psychologists are talking about the alienation between people and machines. And you begin to see this sort of narrow rutdom, for lack of a better term, that people are beginning to get. And I think it's important that we all spend some time working on our right brains, that we not spend so much time in between all the formulas and the web surfing and so forth, that it's important to be the other half too, to work on your creative side. And somehow giving people access to all this information does not mean that they should all now go bury themselves and become inhuman. That in fact it's an aid to building our society. So to me, if you go back to this fact that there's this surplus of information and it's enormously successful, you end up with a situation where access to information becomes ubiquitous and people think it's disruptive because there's so much of it and much of it is wrong. But I and Google certainly believes that there is value in the community and that even with bad information, eventually the smart people figure out what the right information is and it bobbles up. So the solution to misinformation is more information and better access and better transparency, not to suppress it, not to regulate it, and so forth. So if you think about it, I'm an optimist in this. What are some of the things that you can do? Well, first is obviously close the digital divide. It seems obvious that it's a huge, huge thing. And it's to the same degree that access to clean water should be a birthright for every human brought in the planet, the same should be to some level of connectiveness. We're on our way, but we're not there yet. You all know that the US is not the #1 broadband country. We're 15th, and that's a national shame from my perspective. Only 55% of Americans have broadband connections at home, by the way. So even in our own country, which is certainly a rich country even today, we have some work to do. It doesn't happen fast enough, but people will take things into their hands. If you get people more involved, for example, in government, they'll set up pseudo-government websites where they'll get the information that the government should be doing and publish it for their local community. So people have an enormous amount of time to work on these things when they have tools and they have access to the information. In our case, we're working on things like a fiber optic link between East Africa and Asia and Europe, basically because there's no real way to reach those countries. We're also doing something called O3b, which is a network of low Earth orbiting satellites. O3b stands for the other 3 billion. It's a way, which is interesting, which is a way to reach the handsets of the other 3 billion who do not have access to the information that we're talking about. Another prescription is to adapt to our information environment. It just seems to me that the internet is disruptive, and it's disruptive in a way that critics love to pounce on. This is not a new idea. When Samuel Morse invented the telegraph, he said, "What hath God wrought?" was the first telegraph message. By the way, that was 1844. We're still alive today, right? So this is progress, 160 years later. And in every one of these technologies, when they come, people say, well, this is going to cause this problem and so forth. My favorite is the Atlantic Monthly cover, is Google making us stupid? And the basic argument was that because people aren't reading anymore, in fact, they are reading, they're just not deep reading, there's no deep thinking. And that's an easy argument to fight, because in fact, all the studies indicate that the kind of symbolic and development that's going on now is hugely useful for the complex world that people are going to foresee in the next 10 or 20 years. You know, and it's not a new idea. Socrates feared the written word, and Plato believed that writing would create new modes of thought altogether and provide new and wonderful uses for the intellect, right? So the debate is not a new one by any means. If we encourage debate, another prescription, it does let the truth outline. If we think about this problem of too much information, it's all coming to us, the solution is to have more transparency and more conversation. An example here is what I'm going to call the internet sort of truth police, which now exist. The best example is, unfortunately, Mrs. Clinton and her remarks about Bosnia. And you'll remember what happened was she made various claims about Bosnia, which were subsequently proved false by a set of analyses of videos and so forth. What was interesting about it was that people make mistakes, and both major candidates have stretched the truth and so forth and so on today for sure. The fact of the matter is they kept saying them. Even though the internet police, as I'll call them, kept saying, hey, it's not true. And all of a sudden and eventually one side collapsed, and the side that collapsed was the side that did not have a leg to stand on. This point is a point that I think is not understood in American politics today. There's been a fundamental and irrevocable way in which American politics has changed. Excuse the term, Rovian, unquote, politics, the politics of these sort of very, very strong claims that are made, which can be fought, are now quickly fought by citizens who see themselves as the protectors of truths. And it makes it much harder if you want to make a strong claim, and indeed people will make strong claims, you have to make it quickly before you're discovered. And then you have to come up with another one the next day. I'm not arguing for this, but you get the idea. And I think people have missed this. So all of a sudden now, the campaigns that are on message, right, are the ones that survive this sort of critical attack. Put another way, I don't think this sort of swift boating model works anymore. And if you give customers a choice, they will ultimately want transparency and truth. Another example is that almost all evidence of decision making says that better decisions are made by teams that see all the information. So as a guest of New York and not really being an expert in the financial market, in listening and talking to all the people involved with it, in most cases there was a lack of transparency as to what was going on. And in particular, our government clearly did not understand the level of risk and so forth. Now go through the thought experiment and imagine that from a regulatory perspective, much of that information had been published but was otherwise ignored. A reasonable assumption is that this group of, I'm going to call them internet police or people who care about that, they would have figured it out. There would be a whole new set of voices saying, hey, there's a problem, here's an argument, and so forth and so on. My point here is that you can do this, and you can do this on your own if the information is available for you. Open systems in this context win. In open systems, you all understand open networks, open ideas, open ventures. Open networks, the architecture of the internet is an open network. You can basically connect anything in. The first four, no one understood that there would be 1,000 and then 10,000, and I was part of some of that. It never occurred to anyone that there would be 500,000 networks today with God knows how many computers on them. It's a pretty amazing achievement, which we're very proud of. But by being open, you can basically plug things in. In the internet, it's called the end-to-end principle. The internet itself does not regulate what goes on in the ends. It just gets you from point A to point B. And all of a sudden, a lot of innovation. It's not a closed network. If you're open to new ventures, you want to be building businesses that have what I call max strategies. And put another way, the notion of restricting access to information doesn't really work anymore. It may work for incumbents, and it may work for existing brands. But for new businesses, if you have an idea, you're going to want to get it in every path and every place as quickly as possible, because if you don't, somebody else will. In the compression of time, these strategies of distribution are how people will ultimately differentiate. And it means, by the way, for example, that there will be if these distribution networks follow what is called a power law. So what will happen is that there will be a smaller number of incredibly globally famous groups. And that's who you're competing with when you enter in these, because distribution costs are zero. Another, of course, impact that it has to do with economics. And in fact, you see this already with a much greater emphasis on live performances for revenue, because on the margin, the marginal cost of goods ultimately gets pretty close to its distribution cost. And in digital goods, it's very, very difficult to charge very much for the content unless you restrict it in some interesting way. So if you follow that and you believe in the power of individuals and you embrace them, what you see is the internet is shifting power in a really, really fundamental way. It's shifting from institutions to individuals. And this is not going away. And it means that your business strategy, the way you approach things, needs to be very, very different. And what's interesting about individuals is they have, as I said, they have a lot of creativity, a lot of ability. There are lots and lots of examples of people who've been able to reach out and mobilize people. Groups of people using Facebook, for example, to save Burma, right? 19-year-olds who've never been to Burma are worried about it. The Obama campaign is well understood as being an internet success in terms of its ability to raise money. How do they get so many people to show up at the rallies, which they give 24 hours notice to? They text them. Boom, do you want to come to a rally? Boom, they're all there. This technique, of course, now will become standard for all future political campaigns. So my point here, and trying to put this into some sort of a conclusion, is that the world is changing in some really fundamental ways, and it has a lot to do with the power and ubiquity of information. That information is the thing that we are strongest about. It is the thing that we have the most about. And that I'm optimistic because I see almost every problem that the world faces as an information problem. That ubiquitous access to information enables every party to start conversations with the other. Imagine if you knew actually what was going on as opposed to sort of, on the phone with your advisors, and then you pick up the red phone and you call up Moscow to try to prevent the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you think about oil as sort of a limited phenomena and information as an infinite position, you see the transition as a metaphor between those two. If you believe, as I do, that the sort of constant interaction between us as intellectual, as people striving for the best ideas, that the creativity of this phenomena is something we've not yet fully understood, and that that's something that's coming before us in the next few years. If we find these answers, I think we will find the answers in the economic area, in the political area, in the social area. And I think that you should set no limits to your platform strategy. You should say, these are max strategies, and that you should take the biggest risk you can to get the most reach for every single idea that you have. If it works, you'll end up with a huge success, and if it doesn't work, you'll have a quick failure, because that's the way our markets work. I was trying to think about what does the future look like 5 years from now? Much bigger internet, much more connectivity, many, many more things going on. And I was trying to think about some products that I would like to build. One product I'd like to build is Serendipity, which is a product which I'm typing, and Google says, oh, that's what you should have typed. Seems like a reasonable product. I mean, why doesn't Google know that? Why, if I say like, the president of, in 1860 was Lincoln, and they'll say, no, you idiot, it was Jefferson, or whatever. Why can't it do that automatically for me? It has every piece of information that it needs to be able to do that. Okay, so if you like that product, why don't we build a paper lengthening product? Take the paper, make it 10% longer. Oh, and by the way, make it recursive so you can keep making it longer and longer and longer. So you sit there and you go, wow, is that possible? Yeah, because we can read the text, we can see what everybody else has said, and we can summarize it, and then we can actually make it longer. And today it's not very good, but the idea is there. And with this next generation of technology, it'll clearly be possible. So then the next question that I want to ask is, well, what should I do tomorrow? A reasonable question to ask your computer, don't you think? Right? You used to ask your friend, now you can ask your computer. Your computer's with you 24 hours a day. What should I do tomorrow? Now, how would the computer know that? Well, it knows a lot about you. You have to decide to enable these features, of course, for privacy reasons. But it also knows everything that's going on, and it can check every activity a lot quicker than you can and give you some suggestions. When you think about this, and you think about it, what you conclude is that while there's a ubiquity of information, that there is also fundamentally a need for narrative, and that every one of these experiences that I'm talking about will ultimately be seen in a narrative context. It'll be seen as a story, a life experience, something that I care about, because that's ultimately what drives us. So in trying to understand how people think about this, what's the most extreme case? Well, the most extreme case is would you be willing to put a chip in your head that directly accessed the internet? Okay, so a study was done, and I'm not kidding. 11% of people in the United States would willingly, safely implant in their mind a device that would allow them to directly access the internet so they didn't have to bother typing. Okay. I'm heartened to know that 17% of them were male and 7% were females, once again proving the point. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions.